Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning, or it might be this evening. Who knows? But it's morning here. Baruch, yes. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And I'm about to share the screen. And well, so yesterday I was struggling with one of these sentences, and I went over it again, and frankly, I don't know why I was having such a problem with it, but I'm going to try again just to make sure I can translate it for you in an accurate kind of way. So I'm going to give it a try before I move on to the next piece. All right. And look, I mean, that's the whole idea of struggling with the Torah. And it is the way it goes. So here we go. So there, we were talking about fish, and we were talking about them having fins and scales, right? And it says in the Hebrew, "Kol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskeset b'mayim," anything that doesn't have fins and scales in the water, sheket hulachem, it needs to be treated as something detestable. So, asher ein lo, which it does not have. We've already been told that it needs to have them. Ma Talmud Lomar. What is Scripture teaching us? Shiachol, because it's possible to interpret this. Ein lo sheyeh mutar. In other words, or ein li sheyeh mutar. I cannot accept a fish as acceptable. Ela hama'ale simanim shelo leyabasha. Only if it takes its fins and scales, whatever signs we need that are the indications of a kosher fish, onto the dry land. In other words, if somehow when we remove from the fish from the water, the fins and scales fall off, right? So we're saying that we might have thought that those fins and scales have to remain on the fish, whether it's in the water or out of the water. In other words, I would only understand it to mean that it refers to fish who retain their scales both in the water and out of the water. And just to clarify, Heshiran, if it removes those fins and scales, all right. All right, let's see. Okay, let's make sure I'm going into this again. Okay, Heshiran Pamayim, right. Minayan. So if they fell off while it was in the water, right? While it's in the water, these scales fall off, or it loses its fins or something. Talmud Lomar. For that reason, Scripture teaches us, Kol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskeset b'mayim. It teaches us that it refers to fish that do not have fins and scales while they're living in the water. Ha'im hayulo b'mayim. So that if as long as this fish has those fins and scales while it is in the water, even though it may remove those fins and scales when it comes out of the water, when it comes up, mutar, it is permissible. So as long as it's got the fins and scales while it's in the water, if it loses those fins and scales or casts them off when it comes up from the water, it is still permissible. And that's a good reading of this. Okay. Going on. And I'm glad we had this chance to clarify that sentence. Ve'et elu tishakzu minaof. So now we're onto a whole new category, and these you shall render detestable, right? You should avoid them as all possible from fowl, right? Birds. Lo ye'achlu. Okay, they shall not be eaten. This form of ye'achlu is a passive sense. They shall not be eaten. Sheketz haim, they're to be considered detestable. So it could even be saying, this is how we need to consider them, that we wouldn't want to put them in our mouths even. Et hanesha. And now we go on with the specific birds that are forbidden. Now, the fact that there are specific birds that are forbidden, in principle, would mean that since there are so many, many, many different species of birds, far more than are listed here, specific species, more birds are permissible than are considered detestable or forbidden. The complication possibly is that, of course, each species has also subspecies as well, right? So it says the eagle. Well, there are all kinds of eagles, right? But here we are. So, et hanesher. So an eagle is forbidden. Ve'et haperes, the vulture. Ve'et haozniya, and the black vulture. Now, again, we're into names of animals, and we have to depend on Talmud and the tradition as to what these names refer to, what birds they really are. This is a great challenge in terms of translation. And we are going to see in the Rashi, because Rashi is going to try and help us as much as possible, that there are disputes as to what the actual bird is. What kind of bird is it? So let's take a look first here. Lo ye'achlu, right? So he's going to comment on the fact that it says they shall not be eaten in that passive sense. And in the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat on page 114, it says, Lechayev et hama'achilin laktanim. That is to say, that even though a minor, a boy under 13, a girl under 12 and a half, is considered a minor and is not obligated to perform commandments, is not under the obligation of the commandments. And by the way, let me say parenthetically, that is the very basic foundational meaning of becoming a bar or bat mitzvah. It means you have now attained a majority and you are now responsible yourself for observing the mitzvot or violating them, that you yourself are that, have to bear the consequences. But it really means that one should be practicing mitzvot. At any rate, up to that point, you are not under the obligation to practice mitzvot under that or to be held accountable. However, if as a parent, you then make your child or allow your child to violate mitzvot. There are some mitzvot for which there may not be any penalty, but in this particular case, if you actively feed your child a non-kosher bird, you are held responsible. And that's what Rashi is saying, right? So he says to hold responsible one who feeds to any one of these birds to minors. Shekach mashmalo, because that's the implication here. Lo yiyo nechalim, they should not be consumed. Al yadcha, right? Or by your means. In other words, we're talking now about actively feeding a child one of these birds. If a child feeds themselves the bird, they're not going to be held liable. But if you feed the child that this kind of bird that's forbidden, you are now going to be liable. Okay. So you nechalim al yadcha, by your agency. And then there's a question. O eino ela le'asram b'hana'ah. Or perhaps, since this seems to be adding another layer of meaning to the prohibition, maybe it has nothing to do with minors and feeding it to minors, but it's simply saying you're not allowed to benefit. In other words, you can't sell birds and sell one of these birds or these kind of birds and make a profit. Maybe that's what it means when it says they shall not be consumed. Or if you have a restaurant and you're serving one of these kinds of birds in your restaurant. Talmud Lomar. So is that a possibility? It's a possibility. So Talmud Lomar, for this reason, in Deuteronomy, where these laws are repeated to some extent, there it says, Lo tochelu, you shall not eat them. You shall not eat them. And because it emphasizes in Deuteronomy, in that second mentioning, that it has to do with consuming them, Ba'achila asurim. You are only forbidden to consume these birds, any one of these birds, bahana'a mutarim. But on the other hand, you are allowed to trade in them. You're allowed to benefit from them in other kinds of ways. It is limited to only eating them, ingesting them. So now Rashi goes on to tell us a general principle, because we are talking now not only about the fact that these birds are intrinsically forbidden, but they also render a person tameh. They also have the possibility of rendering a person impure. So, of course, that whole subject of purity and impurity is one that we have talked about before, and it is a very arcane and in some senses difficult subject for us to fully comprehend. But I believe that it has, in some ways, to understand it, it has to do with mortality and immortality. It also has to do with deep psychological issues as well. But here he goes on to say, so there are layers and levels of impurity. It's important to know that there are several layers of impurity going from the least to the most. And the implications on a practical level have to do with participating in the sacrificial system or in the temple or making offerings or consuming offerings or even entering the temple precinct, etc. There are all kinds of prohibitions associated with that. So when it says, he says here, Rashi says, Kol of shene'emar bo lemina, lemino, leminehu. It's going to use this expression, one of these words, in the following sentences. Lemina means according to its species. Okay, lemino is the masculine of that. This is just the feminine here, and this is the masculine one. If the bird is considered the word in Hebrew is considered masculine or feminine, leminehu according to their species again. All right, so minehu means it would be plural species, and here species singular is what it would be. Yesh be'oto hamid. So when it uses this, in other words, when it expands the kind of bird that we're talking about in that particular species, she'en domin zeh lazeh. And so they're telling you the reason why the Torah uses this particular expanding expression is that in that particular species, ein domin zeh lazeh, they don't necessarily look, even though they belong to the same species, they don't necessarily look exactly like the other. Lo b'mar'ehem, not how they appear, neither how they appear, velo bishmotam, nor their names. In other words, their names may be quite distinct from one another, and yet they all belong to the same species of bird. V'kulan min echad. But the fact of the matter is, they still are considered all one species. Okay, so let's go into this a little bit further now. So, ve'et hada'a, the kite, kind of, I believe it's a kind of, it's certainly a bird of prey. Ve'et ha'aya, and the falcon, lemina, and here's that word, lemina, according to their species. Et kol orev, any kind of crow, lemino. So here we have lemino, right? Because the word orev is masculine. And the word da'a and aya, notice the ending of this ending, both words, is typically indicates a feminine noun. Okay. Ve'et bat haya'ana, and literally, it means an ostrich. That's what it's referring to. Ve'et, and the hatachmas, the nighthawk, ve'et hashachaf, and the seagull, ve'et hanetz, and the hawk, leminehu, according to their species. Okay, or according to its species. So let's take a look at is there any Rashi up to this point? I believe there is this Tetzain. So he talks about Hanates, and we translated Hanates as a hawk, but Rashi goes a little bit further and he says Ispure, and that is and by the way, you hear the word sparrow in here, and it's a sparrowhawk. And sperber is the Yiddish word for sparrowhawk. I will tell you that when I was looking up these particular, like the Old French or the Yiddish, in some cases I was able to find translations. This is what I did. I mean, I believe this is, in fact, it's related to a modern French word. And sperber is the word for sparrow in Yiddish. So I found it. It wasn't a problem. But there are others where it was far more challenging and where I didn't find a translation at all. So I'm doing the best I can. These particular these translations are based on the edition in Sefaria. I think it could be based on JPS, if I'm not mistaken. Going on. Ve'et hakos, the little owl, ve'et hashalach, and the cormorant, ve'et hayanshuf, and the great owl. Rashi's going to try and help us here. So, et hashalach, right? The shalach. Pirshu Rabotenu, our sages explain in Chulin. This is a tractate in the Talmud that deals with the issues of kashrut and what meat we can consume. Ze ha-sholeh, right? So the reason why it's called a shalach, it's one who removes, right? In other words, he removes piresh magbia. So explain sholeh means to raise up dagim min hayam, fish from the sea. So it's a cormorant is a water bird, and again they're able to fish, right? Vezehu shetirgem Onkelos, and this is precisely why Onkelos translates it in Aramaic, ush veshinuna, shni nuna, right? So that's and so nuna are fish, shni nuna. Oh, sorry, it looks like is it shli nuna? Let's take a look at where that is. Yeah, there it is. Vishale nuna, and the one that fishes, right? So it could be a kingfisher as well, right? So going on. So it's shili luna. My translation, here we go. Let me do that so we could see that this is a lamed, shli nuna. Kos, right? The yanshuf. The kos is the little owl, and the yanshuf is the great owl. Haim. Okay, so this looks like soite. Okay, and what's helpful is the Yiddish, and that's nacht eile, night owls. Well, we know that owls are essentially nocturnal birds, but an eile in Yiddish is an owl. And he goes on to say, Hatzoakim balayla, that cry out at night. We know about the owl's sounds. V'yesh lahem listot ka'adam, and they have cheeks like a man. So assuming that we did not know that this word is meant owl, this would help us to be able to visualize what we're talking about. Ve'od acher, sorry, Ve'od achar dome lo shekorin hibo. So there is another kind of owl that looks like it that is called a hibo, right? And here we go, de ohu, right? So again, ohu is probably a word that means owl of some kind. Onwards. Ve'et hatin shemet, the white owl, ve'et haka'ah, and the pelican, ve'et haracham, and the bustard, right? So let's take a look here. Okay, so here we're going to go on. No Rashi on that. Ve'et hachasidah, and the stork. That's actually the modern name for stork in Hebrew. Okay, sorry. Forgive me. Let's go back. Et hachasidah, the stork, ha'anafa lamina, and herons according to their species. There's that lamina, the et haduchifat, and the hoopoe, the et ha'atalef, and the bat. Okay. So flying animals. So let's see if we've got just the beginning here. Yes. Hachasida, the stork. Zo daya levana. Okay. This is, so remember, we used the word daya and we translate it as a kite. Okay. Levana. This is a white kite. And here is the French. I do not know how to pronounce it, for example. Uh, I don't know how to pronounce it, but in Yiddish, ein Storch, right? Ein Storch. So there's a very similar word in German to our word in English. Velama nikra shma chasida. And why is it called? Why is the name of this bird chasida, right? A chasid is a God lover, right? And the word chesed has to do with kindness, showing kindness. She'osa chasidut im chavroteha, because she acts in a kind way with her neighbors, b'mezonot, when it comes to food, when it comes to sharing food. Anafa, he daya ragzanit. So this anafa is, ragzanit means angry, right? The angry kite. Venir Eli, Rashi says personally now, and it appears to me, shehi shekorin la heron. French word that sounds awfully like our modern one, right? And that's what they call a heron. And this is obviously the Yiddish for heron. So in this case, the medieval French sounds a lot more like the English than the Yiddish. Duchifat, the hoopoe. Tarnagol habar, it's considered a wild chicken. The carbalato and its crest, kafula, is folded. Uvelaz harufa, right? It sounds very much like horpu, right? And Widerhof means, if you can visualize a hoopoe, you note that its crest is turned backwards. So Wider means, I'm sure Hopf is something like head, right? And it's head again or something like that to describe its unusual and unique crest. Velami nikra shmo duchifat, right? So why does it get this name duchifat? Shehodo kafut, because it's, and I think in this case its crest is chained together. Vezo hi karbalato, and this is okay. So duchifat. So the duchi is this hodu somehow, or duchifat kafut or duchavut. Vezohi karbalato, and that's referring to its crest. The nagar Tura and mountain splitter. It's called a mountain splitter, Nikra al Shem, and it's called because the way it behaves, Kamoshe Pirshu Rabbonatenu, is as our rabbis explained, B'Masechta Gitin, in the tractate Gitin, Beperek Misha Achzor, in a chapter that says Misha Achzor, referring to someone who maybe gave his wife a get, but was doing it purely emotionally or wasn't quite fully conscious of what they were doing. At any rate, I tried to find the reference in Gita, and I looked it up, and I wasn't able to find it. So I'm afraid I can't tell you much more than that. And let's see, how much do we see? Okay, we'll do one more sentence. Kol sheretz ha'of. So, in other words, all swarming flying creatures. When you say off, it comes from the word la'uf, to fly. Ha'olech arba, which goes on four. Sheket hulachim. It is also to be considered something detestable. And I'm going to put the marking in here, and I'll take a look at the Rashi. We'll take a look at the Rashi. Okay. Okay. So I'm sorry, it goes, let's see. Yes. So we're right here. over here. Let's take a look at the Rashi. Kol sheretz off, right? Haim hadakim. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the insects essentially. Hanemuchim, right? So dakim small, hanemuchim that are low, haruchashim that swarm al haaretz over the earth. Kagon zvuvim, and he gives examples like flies, v'tzirin and hornets, v'tushim and mosquitoes, v'chagavim and locusts. And this is where we'll stop today. Okay. Well, thanks. It's good to see you, David and Judith. Welcome. So, okay. Before I stop the recording, anything you want to say off, you know?
Yeah, I was wondering about wild chicken. What does
Yeah.
it mean? I eat chicken, but I don't know. It says don't eat
It's
wild chicken.
it's just simply okay. So with birds, it's interesting. It's a halacha referring to birds. He's just simply saying that the hoopoe is sometimes referred to as a wild chicken. All right. Uh,
Oh,
so the truth is that we are only allowed to eat domesticated birds. In other words, we are not the in Jewish law, you're not allowed to go and trap birds, or in other words, and kill them by trapping them or shooting them or whatever and consuming them. That is not permissible. You have to raise the birds, and then you can then consume them. That is the ones that are left out of this list. Um,
I,
and it could
Rabbi, I
be
don't
that
understand that.
Harlan, 1 second, and it could also be that that it's based in part on that interpretation that you just referred to, right? That the wild chicken wouldn't be permissible. Yes, you were going to say. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I don't understand that. If you have a hunt, if you're hunting turkey and you're shooting the turkey, it's not permissible to eat it. But if
Not
you're
kosher.
shooting a deer, it's permissible to eat it.
Say that deer.
Yeah, if you shoot a deer, if you're hunting
Well,
deer.
again, no, you wouldn't be able to do that. Remember, you have to shech the animal. So you can trap the deer, and then yes, it doesn't have to be raised. This is at least how I understand it. Okay. That I mean, ideally you should have to raise it, but I think you can trap deer and and then shecht it properly, and then it's kosher. My understanding is that this particular law about it having to be domesticated has to do with fowl only. Okay.
Oh.
All right. So I'm going to stop unless you want to follow up a little bit, but that's it. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop the recording.